You ever find yourself at a point where your entire world shifts and you know damn well life won't ever be the same? That was me the first time I hung up the uniform and traded the boots for a suit. And let me tell you, it wasn't smooth sailing. Transitioning out of the military, it's like jumping into a new world where the mission isn't clear, trust takes longer to build, and you're constantly asking, where the hell do I fit in, right? But here's the thing about transitions, they're not just about change, they're about growth, staying resilient, and maybe even reinventing yourself along the way. And today's guest, oh, he's lived that story through and through. I'm thrilled to sit down with the Honorable Dr. John Hillen. Yeah, you heard that right. A former Army captain who's been in the thick of high stakes moments like patrols along the Iron Curtain the night the Berlin Wall fell, the heat of Desert Storm, and the legendary Battle of 73 Easting. That kind of leadership you don't just leave behind when the uniform comes off. Since his Army days, John's built and sold companies, taught leadership and strategy at some of the top schools, written game changing books, and even served as Assistant Secretary of State. The dude's got wisdom for days, but here's the kicker. He's not just talking theory. He's lived this pivot, battled the same transition struggles so many of us face, and he's done it with grit, humor, and a hell of a lot of heart. So if you ever felt like you're wading through the unknown, trying to figure out your post-military identity, or hell, just navigating the major life shift, this episode's for you. John's here to drop some serious truths on resilience, leadership, and how to forge your next mission, wherever it takes you. So let's get into it. John, brother, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Great to be here.
First question for everybody, man. Where'd you grow up and what inspired you to join?
Yeah, so I was born on a Army post in the middle of an Indian reservation, if you can believe that.
I can.
Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where the Army hospital is just a couple of miles from Geronimo's grave. So unusual place for a guy from a family of New York City immigrants to be born, but that's kind of the Army story, right? So my dad served my family's Army back to the Civil War, but professionally, really, my father and I did unbroken service of some kind between the mid '50s and the mid 2000s and beyond. So yeah, I touched a lot of Army bases growing up, and but ultimately sort of got raised in the Northern Virginia area due to Vietnam War injuries for my father and Pentagon tours to recuperate and things like that.
Yeah, so I guess the Army was never really a question for you. It was just kind of, this is where we're going.
Well, it was, it's a good thing about my dad, even though he was a professional and a pretty notable Vietnam vet who had been almost mortally wounded over there. And yet when I was coming up, he still was of the mind, well, this is your life. I had my life. So he was a good, and for a Green Beret, decorated combat vet, he's a pretty chill guy. And I think
not typical of that era of veteran, right?
Yeah, and plus, I mean, if you had been through what he had been through, I think it accounts for a lot. He, on the other side of his almost near-death experience in Vietnam, I think he always felt like he was living with house money, and so he was a more chill guy. But there wasn't a lot of pressure on me. When I came up, I went through high school and then into college during the Reagan buildup. And there was this, and especially if you came from a Vietnam veteran family, there was this sense in the early 1980s, we're back, right? There was this awful period. We left Vietnam with our tail between our legs. We let down our allies in South Vietnam. So I'm very empathetic with the veterans in your generation, how they might feel the same way about Afghanistan or something else, the people they fought with over there. And so there's just a malaise, a bad feeling in America in the 70s. And we started to bounce back. We're resilient people, which is a great thing about this country that I just love so much. And I was coming up, and what a great time to be a youth. And so, the Reagan almost doubled the size of the armed forces. And so I ended up going to college on an ROTC scholarship because I went to a snotty, expensive college, and I wouldn't have been able to afford it otherwise. And into the Army. And so It was both natural, but it was also, entirely my choice, and I was glad to make it.
You had some pretty interesting events in your career. The one that fascinates me the most is you were literally patrolling the Berlin Wall when it came down. What was that like?
Yeah, so I got to pick my branch in my unit, and because my father had been an infantry officer, and I thought, well, infantry people are noble and brave, but just not very glamorous. I mean,
It's
Adam, I'm not
true.
trying to paint. I'm not trying to paint you with a brush here, but
It's true. It's true.
yeah. So I thought every cavalry officer I'd ever seen in the movies was sexy, had elan, a kind of spirit. So I said, that's me. Now I don't think it was me, but I got to pick it. So I go to a cavalry regiment, and since the end of World War II, the Second Armored Cavalry Regiment had been patrolling the Iron Curtain since it went up in 1946, 47, 48. And so we would rotate up to the border from our main base in Germany. And it just so happened that my little cavalry troop, where we had a brand new young captain commanding it, a guy named H.R. McMaster, who later went on to become a 3-star general and a national security advisor to President Trump in his first administration. We just happened to be rotated up there in November 1989. And that's when the whole thing imploded. And it was so dramatic and so life-changing. I mean, you didn't have to be a historian to recognize you were at the vortex of this monumental historical event. And it was so impactful. Actually, that was the start of my writing career. I wrote a first-person account of what it was like to be on the wall when the wall came down, in a magazine. And that kind of took, in some ways, that took my whole career in a different direction and added another dimension to it anyway.
That's
But
so cool.
one of the things that sticks with me about that, Adam, is, I have a almost mystical connection with this country. I mean, I'm just deeply in love with it. And one of the reasons is I've seen things like that night in
Right.
November 1989. And when the East Germans came over the border to meet their West German countrymen for the first time in 2 generations, the thing that stuck with me, among many, many other things, is the East Germans didn't know how to smile, right? They hadn't practiced smiling in 2 generations, except maybe in very private moments. And they just couldn't understand why everybody was smiling so much on the other side. And that just stuck with me. I'm like, wow, you can lose the bubble on what it means to be a free people and never go quite how deep that goes. And that kind of experience, and then being like you and in some of the really challenging bits of the world. I've been in over 90 countries around the world. So I've been through a bunch of passports, blue, maroon, black passports, the whole range. Every time I go abroad, I come back, I'm like, God, am I lucky to be an American? And
Right.
that night especially cemented the value of the political freedom that we're just lucky enough to live in.
It's almost like communism robs you of a lot of things, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't know how to smile. 2 generations of people not knowing how to smile. That sounds pretty miserable. I always ask, anybody who was by the Berlin Wall. I've had a couple other veterans who, would have to go into West Germany and do some patrolling and stuff over however that worked. And it's a unique period of time in history. I've always been fascinated with it since, I was a kid, because the wall literally went up overnight. Right. Like there's not a wall there. And then people wake up the next morning, there's a wall
Right.
there, and then it's there for a long time, 2 generations. Right. And then all of a sudden it comes down, and it's interesting to hear your perspective on when their fellow countrymen go to meet their other countrymen. And it's just night and day difference in personalities and emotions being experienced. And that's wild. I can imagine why you were inspired to write that first person account, because I think often, experiences like that, we have to capture them, so that we don't forget, like it's a pretty monumental thing.
Exactly. And little things stick with you that mean a lot. So another observation of my time is the East Germans would stop in the first West German village they came to. And this is not a heavily populated area because by nature of the Iron Curtain going through it. So it's rural with small villages. And the East Germans, they just pull over their little 2-stroke, engine cars, these little warthogs that they had. And, these tiny little 2-stroke engines spitting out fumes. And they would pull over and look in a shop window, and they just stare, because there were 3 kinds of vacuum cleaners for sale. Not one, not the government approved one, but 3 totally different kinds. You had a choice of 3 vacuum cleaners, and they would just stare open mouthed. They were like, wow, what happened? We're all Germans. Look what these guys did in the last 50 years, and look what we're stuck with. We have to get on a waiting list to get one kind of vacuum cleaner for 4 months. at the government-run store. So those little things like that, and the fact that they were the same people with the same history, which had been artificially cleaved by the Cold War and the kind of Soviet domination in one part of Germany and the Western influence on the other part of Germany. But you could see all these thoughts rolling through their head as they just stared through the shop windows. So there's a lot going on there in seemingly small moments.
Yeah. And then 2 years later, you'd find yourself overseas in support of the Battle of 73 Easting, which I have to admit I've never heard of. I actually don't know a lot about Desert Storm. I know that there were some operations that went on. I know that it was really kind of onesies and twosies units here and there. It wasn't like mass scale deployments like what I was familiar with whole, battalions. But talk about that experience a little bit.
Yeah, so we were all surprised by it. The U.S. was a little bit surprised by it when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. We had no defense treaty with Kuwait. We didn't have a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. But it kind of freaked out the world. If you remember, it happened is the wall falls. We're going to now have this unprecedented period of peace. And all of a sudden, in the middle of that, the fourth biggest army in the world in Iraq and a very aggressive power that had just finished an 8-year war with Iran invades and completely takes over a neighbor, an oil-rich, undefended little country in Kuwait. And then the Saudis were next. Their mass, the Saudi royal family and everybody related to it flees to hotels on the other side of the country or elsewhere. I mean, they're giving up, and that's when the kind of world jogged into action and formed an international coalition, with the U.S. being the biggest member. There's like 36 countries in this coalition. We think about it as a U.S. war. There were 36 countries represented over there. I mean, the Brits sent a whole division, and the French sent foreign legionnaires and all the rest. And we, frankly, were sitting there in Germany, and we're on the other side of the Cold War mission, and we haven't quite gotten around to, well, what do we do next with these 300,000 American troops in Germany? And then this happens, and we all scramble for the maps. Where's Kuwait? Where's Iraq? And then we go over there initially to defend Saudi Arabia, and then ultimately, President then H.W. Bush, the father, makes the decision to, along with other international leaders, to forcibly expel the Iraqis from Kuwait after months and months of negotiations, and the Iraqis weren't gonna budge. So all of a sudden, we had signed up to and trained for a couple of generations of army people to fight a defensive war in the hills of Germany, and now we're fighting an offensive war in a featureless desert.
Yeah, interesting.
It's a real pivot.
Yeah. No, that's awesome, man. So, I'm. How long did you actually spend in the military? What led to the decision did you retire? Did you just say, hey, it's time to get out, I'm going to move on with my life? And kind of talk about what that transition was like for you.
Sure. So I did 4 years active duty. And then that was, part of my commitment to pay back the ROTC scholarship. And then at the end of that 4 years, a couple of things all coincided, right? I always tell people I'm coaching, I'm like, life is contingent, man. You can have all the plans you want, but things happen. And the better characteristic you have instead of being a great planner is to be resilient and opportunistic. So several things happened once. I got an offer to go to graduate school in the UK. The Army post Cold War victory, post Desert Storm victory, is downsizing, and I had a deal I didn't like from the Army, which was to go to Fort Hood, Texas, and be a logistics officer, because I'd always been an operator. I was a cavalry scout and a tank platoon leader and an operator. I was in the middle of the biggest tank battle since World War II, right? So I had an exciting career. And the idea of being a logistics person in Fort Hood, no disrespect to logistics or Fort Hood, was very unexciting to me. So I popped smoke from the active Army and went to the UK to study, international security related stuff, which is really cool. I went to a school. It was like going to Hogwarts. You know, it was one of those kind of things. I ended up at Oxford, in fact, for my PhD, where a lot of Harry Potter was filmed. So it was that kind of environment. So it was a really exciting environment. I kept my military commitment and went into the reserves as a civil affairs person on the special operations side. So I actually went through the Kennedy Special Warfare School one summer. I went back on jump status, resumed my paratrooping career, which was very fun. So I did another 6-7 years as an active reservist, including jumping and Kuwait with special forces and all kinds of other things. But I just pivoted my life and said, I'm going to keep the Army here, but I'm going to go in a different direction.
Yeah, for sure. And this is something that not a lot of us do when it's time to get out. So how did you have the foresight? Were you thinking about life after the Army? Had you? I mean, I guess it's just a generational difference, right? Because for me, joining at 17, spending a year on delayed entry, the brainwashing begins, or the programming begins, right? And then September 11th, 2001 happened, right? So now, a 20-year war, knowing you're deploying every other year, right? There's no future of downsizing. In fact, we're surging and we're putting people in the Army who don't need to be in the Army, that kind of stuff. So was it the landscape, kind of what was going on in the Army, that kind of shifted your perspective on, like, I know I don't want to do this for a career. Let me start applying to grad schools or whatever, try to build that post-transition life? Or, what did that look like for you? Because what I'm out here advocating for is, my whole career, every other year, was deployed. I was never thinking about saving money. I was never thinking about life after the Army. I was like, this pays the bills. This is easy. I can do this. They've built me into what they want me to be. So I'm just going to go to 22 years. Never once did I consider my body was going to fail me. I was going to get hurt in combat. I was going to have a bunch of surgeries. And then one day they could say, hey, you can't be an infantryman anymore. We're going to start your med board process. And a year later, you're gone. And then you're outcast, you're shunned, you're not mission critical anymore. They basically forget that you even existed. And so, maybe that very clearly wasn't your experience, but this is, there's a bridge here. And I think your generation of veteran also experienced, their own problems in transition. And for all the haters from Vietnam who say that I'm a whiny little baby and I knew what I was signing up for, they also face their own transition problems. And I think those comments come from a place of unresolved, jealousy or whatever it is that they haven't dealt with themselves. So I'm just really curious, because I think this affects all of us, no matter what generation we come from, no matter how you as an individual view your own transition. I'm sure if you really sat with it, you could find some things that were really hard to get through.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. You know what? And on the bigger picture, and let me pick up on what you said there, because every generation of veterans has their own journey and tough times in that journey, post-conflict, and whenever they make their transition, whatever way. We put a sentimental gloss over the World War II generation, thinking, oh, those guys, they went over there, they did the greatest thing, they came back, they went to college, they fueled the economic growth, right? But yes, and that is a larger trajectory to the story. But underneath, we put 10 million men in uniform in those times. It's a much smaller country. Our 10 million individual stories, many ended by struggle, anxiety, difficulties. In fact, there's a very famous movie I'm trying to remember now about four guys coming home, a couple badly injured, from World War II. It's universally considered one of the top 20 movies made of all time. So this has been with every generation, Revolutionary War, Civil War, you name it. So there's that. On the other hand, one of the things I liked about being with veterans before they were veterans, when we were all serving together with veterans afterwards, is this seems like a cliche, right? But the I can get it done spirit, the can do spirit. So for me and a lot of people in my generation, a bunch of us left around the same time because of the downsizing, it wasn't the push, right? We weren't saying, this is terrible, there's no future here, or, I don't know what's next for me within this context. It was the pull. It was like, wow, there's this whole other world out there. And you know what, I look around at that world when I touch it through my friends or otherwise, what do I see? I don't see the same commitment to um, camaraderie and and unit the unit cohesion. Like, I mean, I've got a son working right now, in investment banking, and right, he's not going to see unit cohesion like we saw,
No, it's an
right?
individual endeavor. It's
Yeah,
who can make the most money for the company climbs the ladder, right? Like that's,
yeah,
I mean, no offense to your son, but
yeah.
that's the game he's playing.
It's the game he's playing. He's going to make a very tidy living, and it's a terrific place, and the people that work there are super cool. It's not the same thing, right? It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing anywhere in the civilian world. And I worked on Wall Street, and I worked as it's not the same anywhere. So there's that, and then there was, at least on my part, I just thought to myself, this is the same way I kind of got through some of the tougher schools in the Army. As I'd look around, I'd see some guy, he's like 6'4", he's got shoulders out here, he's got a little narrow waist. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that guy's going to crush me in this school. Like, if anybody's going to drive it, it's me. And then a little conceit in my mind would come up as we'd go through the training. And I see that guy who was a gym rat and needed 4,000 good calories a day to survive, as he'd be wound down by the sleep and food deprivation, right? I would say, you know what? I think I'm better than him, right? So that conceit would drive me. And so when I was transitioning, I let that play in my head again, no matter how deserved or undeserved it was, which was, I look at these people at these top grad schools. I look at these people applying for new jobs. They can't possibly outwork me. And if they're brighter, I'll figure out a way to catch up. Right. So that was my attitude, which I credit a lot to just being in elite military units. Right. And the other thing, you and I learned downrange, and we've got some of the same dirt under our fingernails because I was going in and out of Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s, albeit in a different position than a serving soldier. So I spent a good amount of time in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Southern Philippines during the post 9/11 period. But the embrace the suck mentality, right? You'd show up at these various things in your civilian life, and people would be whining, complaining, and everything. And I'd be like, oh, that's another advantage I have over these guys. I
Yeah,
know how to embrace
I can
myself.
weather this storm. This is easy for me. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Nobody shot at me today in this awful work situation in New York City.
Yeah, I'm
Right?
not going to get a UCMJ because I didn't execute on X, Y, or Z. Like I get it, man. Did you have any tools or mentors or habits that help soften the adjustment, from active duty to, I remember for me getting out, no plan. I went through a med board, so my transition is all kinds of probably about as messed up as it can possibly be. But for me, when I got to college at 30 years old, and in Washington State, I love what they do for their high school students with Running Start. So your junior and senior year, you can get an associate's degree on top of your diploma. But I'm in flight school with 16, 17-year-old children. And I'm 30 years old, and a lot of things have shifted kind of in society by the time that I had gotten out. A lot of really weird viewpoints on a lot of shit that you can't know anything about unless you have life experience, which I had in spades at that point because I've been to the shittiest places in the world, and so that was a huge adjustment. Did you have to deal with any kind of adjustment like that? And did you have people that you could lean on to kind of vent those things to? Because one of the bigger mistakes I see people make is particularly us infantry guys, we're hard headed. We're told to suck it up, take a knee, face out, right? Not talk about the things that are challenging us. Like you just compartmentalize it, bottle it up, put it in Pandora's box, never to be seen again, which is simply just an outright lie because Pandora's box has a limit and it'll force itself back open. But oftentimes we think we got to do this shit alone, and we're afraid to ask for help because somehow that makes us weak as men or women,
Right.
and just as individuals, which I'm here to argue is completely the opposite. It's the strongest thing you can do is basically admit defeat and ask for help. So did you have any people to lean on, or did you kind of have to walk through that on your own?
No, I was very lucky because you hit a key point. I mean, we just talked about like the combination of things that I think make up a good military experience is, yeah, do you acquire toughness? Do you acquire all that great individual stuff? But this unit cohesion piece, right? I can't recall a single thing in the military that was an individual act, right? It was always a team. And there's a line at the end of the great movie Stand By Me where Richard Dreyfuss is narrating as an older man, and he says, "I never quite had friends like the friends I had that summer when I was 14 or whatever it was, right?" And I think like that. I've never quite had conversations like the ones I had sitting around on Green Ramp, waiting to get on a plane and jump, sitting around the desert in the middle of nowhere, waiting to go across the border and fight a war, patrolling and freezing our asses off in the middle of the night in Germany, right?
It's
And
so funny you're
so,
talking about these events because those are the events that the fondest memories I have, but they were the
yeah,
shittiest times when I was actually
yeah,
going
yeah,
through them, right?
yeah,
I don't go back to deployments. I go back to JRTC rotations and TC
yeah,
rotations when we're
yeah,
stuck in the box, no showers, no nothing, but you're
yeah,
scraping each other's backs with credit cards to get rid of
yeah,
prickly heat. And
yeah,
those are the memories that you're talking about. Those are
yeah, yeah.
great. Yeah.
Yeah, and those conversations, so you're never alone, right? You're never alone. It's a great point you made. The work you're doing, the work, we talked offline, the Station Foundation, which actually aligns mentors with people transitioning from the soft community, and they get them in dialogues and conversations. So you can get used to that pattern. I was very, very lucky. I had a couple of mentors and friends, including, HR McMaster and others who just helped guide me. Like I had a lot of anxiety about going to a top ranked graduate school. I was a very indifferent undergraduate student. I knew I was going into the Army. I was a fraternity guy. I was a DJ. I did my
You were
share
a
of
DJ?
partying. Yeah, yeah.
That's
I had a classic
awesome.
rock radio show on
Yes.
the campus radio station. Um, so you know, I just, and I thought, oh my God, top ranked graduate school. But I had people flying by my side who said, "You got this, man. You got this." And I had in particular one major I worked with in the Army who had already done a PhD, unusual for a cav major. He had a PhD from a top university. And he walked me through the whole thing and gave me this amazing advice. And an artillery guy gave me this advice about doing it. And so people like that are really, really necessary. And I tell people, transitioning or in a similar situation is if you don't have those people, go get them.
Yes.
Go get them. Right?
Yes.
You got to be comfortable with the dialogue of saying, you know, I'm thinking this. I could use your counsel. I could use your advice. And that's a strategic relationship you form. In other words, it's not transactional. You're not like, I'll scratch my back, you scratch mine. I'll credit card your back, you credit card mine. Right? It's not that. It's we're going to have a relationship, and you return my calls, and I return your calls, and we'll help each other when we can. But there's no implied obligation, and the ability of veterans transitioning to form those relationships outside of the veteran community, I think is one of the absolute keys to succeeding, to start building your network of people on whom you can rely for counsel and advice and on whom you will provide counsel and advice to of your own accord. So I think that in and of itself is just a really important skill. And I think that starts bending towards the point you made about there's no admission of helplessness when you do that.
Yeah.
People are social animals. That's what you should do.
Yeah, and we're doing ourselves a disservice by doing that, becoming recluses, going internal, shutting ourselves out from the world. I see it time and time again. I did it. I'm guilty of doing that, right? And to your point, I love that you're touching on this because I know a lot of service members are interested, particularly with the advent of AI and the internet, and it's multi-trillion dollars floating around on the internet for you to just tap into and make money. All these business books become really popular, and all of this stuff, and something I didn't really put a lot of stock into because it's just, in my opinion, it's overused. Is your network is your net worth? Your network is your net worth. And I think the only way you can understand how true that statement really is to start building a network. And by a network, I mean what you were talking about. It's not a trade. It's a mutual. It's a relationship that you're building to build a solid
Right.
network. And I'm telling you, it genuinely is your net worth. It is the most powerful thing I've ever done in my entire life. And I have I have opened some doors for myself that by no means a poor kid from Indiana would have ever thought in a million years that he would be stepping through, or competing in circles for different opportunities, or whatever, all because I chose to reach out to people, to get out of my own way. Even so much so now that no matter where I'm at, everything is a networking event to me. Everything. I've had conversations with people in Costco about Brazilian jiu-jitsu gyms that turn into podcast guests. You know what I mean? Like it's interesting when you change your perspective, what you can accomplish. And so I'm glad that you talk about the network piece, because particularly for us enlisted guys, nobody ever talks about a network. And they don't emphasize get out of the military network and into the civilian world,
Right,
which
right.
is, it's so important, because the military is such a bubble. It's such a bubble. Like, yes, there's a lot of us. Yes, we can instantly relate to one another. And yes, I have several people who served that are a part of my network that I can leverage, that I'm building relationships with. But some of the most powerful connections I have are from people who just want to give back to the veteran community because they didn't serve and they admire what we sacrificed and what we did. And at the drop of a hat, they pick up my phone calls and guide me on my journey here. So I'm glad that you touch on that stuff. And let's talk about what you're doing now, man. You've done all kinds of cool stuff. You've built and sold 4 companies. You've been assistant secretary of state. So you've been involved in politics. You mentioned all the colors of the passports you had in 90 countries that you've been to. Like, what are you up to, man? What are you up to here?
Yeah, so now, I'm in the bit of the give back part of my life. I've been really fortunate in business. I've been fortunate in the policy world, and I got to work for Condoleezza Rice and run political military affairs at the State Department, which is, had me downrange a lot, working with our allies, what I came to call the coalition of the not so willing. And everybody else who was out in the field. Those are just great experiences. So now I'm basically teaching and writing. I teach on a couple different faculties. I teach leadership, I teach strategy, I teach a combination of the two. And so, written a leadership book. My latest book is a strategy book. It's basically a primer, very easy guide. It's called the Strategy Dialogues, for anybody to pick up and in one volume understand the very basics of business strategy.
Yeah, if you're watching this on YouTube, it's right over his left shoulder back there, a little blue
Yeah,
cover.
yeah,
I can
over
see
both shoulders.
it.
Yeah, both. Those are my left and right range fan markers back there.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, no, and it's gotten some great reviews. It's the number one new release on Amazon for the past couple of months in a couple of categories. And I think one of the reasons is because I'm just trying to pull this thing out of the clouds, right? Strategy. Oh, I got to be. That's a intellectual exercise I don't have time for. I work here. I got to get stuff done. Or that's a big company thing. My little company doesn't need a strategy. We just react to events. But the point I'm making there is everybody is expected to be able to think strategically, which means face the future, understand it, and try to shape your journey into it, rather than just be victimized by the future.
Mm-hmm.
And yet at the same time, almost nobody trains on it,
Nobody.
except at the very highest levels.
Yeah.
90% of training, especially for transitioning vets that they'll encounter when they get in the civilian world, is oriented on giving them more technical and tactical skills. Here's project management. Here's computer coding.
Here's CompTIA. Here's LSS green, black, yellow, orange, purple, pink.
Exactly. Yeah. Just stack up the certifications. Right.
Get the alphabet soup behind your name on LinkedIn, and you're successful. Congratulations. You can have whatever job you want, which is simply just not true.
Yeah, exactly. And as soon as anybody is put in charge of something or somebody, their success depends on their strategic and interpersonal skills, not their technical and tactical skills. The CTO of a big tech company doesn't write a line of code. They don't do any networking systems design, but they oversee thousands of people and projects and technology. So they're entirely being judged on their strategic and interpersonal skills, even if it was their technical and tactical skills that got them the job. And yet 90% of corporate training in particular is oriented on technical and tactical skills. So I thought, okay, let's put it in one place, the greatest hits of business strategy and how to think strategically. So the message of the book is strategy is not an answer or a formula or a way to think. or rather a what to think. It's not some outcome. It's a way to think. It's a different, in the same way when you go to the gym and you've got a problem muscle and your trainer's like, look, do this exercise to activate it. Once you activate it, you'll feel it. You'll know what to do. And, like I've got one, it doesn't turn on unless I'm doing like reverse deadlifts or, and like,
Yeah.
okay, all right, now I hear it. Same thing in your brain. It's literally a different part of your brain you use to think strategically. So what I do in the book is basically, here's how to turn it on and here's how to use it. And the more you do that, the more, the broader you'll be as a leader and potentially as an executive. So it's got an annotated thing at the end of every chapter and summary, whiteboard summaries and all that. So I've tried to make it really easy. If you
I
got to
love
take
this.
10 albums to a desert island, these are your 10.
Yeah.
But this is for strategy.
I love that. I'm actually writing a book. I was challenged to write a book about my transition journey and kind of let that live for other veterans to read by some very influential people who want to help me kind of further this. And at the end of every chapter, I'm putting obnoxious takeaways at the end of the chapter. Like, if you read this book and you read nothing but these overly obnoxious takeaways, you'll understand what I'm driving at here. And so I like that you did that in your book too, because it shows that we're on the same wavelength. Like, I don't want people coming to buy my book when it finally comes out and it's done and all of that, and like not getting anything out of it. So I just wanted to make it painfully obvious what I want you to get out of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, I'll tell you this, brother, because, I've done this a couple of times now. So congratulations on that. That's really necessary, what you're doing, but it's neither obnoxious nor painful. So this is the way people learn. One of the things I learned when I became a professor is it's not about what you're saying that represents learning. It's about what they're bringing on board. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of people think, I get CEOs all the time call me up. They're like, hey, I'd like to get in front of your class because I really want to be a professor. I'm like, you don't want to be a professor. You want to talk to people.
Yeah.
That's different, right? Because learning is what happens on their end. And so as soon as you understand the cognitive process, you'll see that, people got to hear it in a couple different ways first, and then they've got to see it in a third or fourth way to really cement it. So your summaries are not only not obnoxious nor painful, they're necessary. They're absolutely necessary for your readers to get what you're saying. You could have the most lucid, articulate prose in your chapters, Adam. I mean, stuff that would make F. Scott Fitzgerald weep with jealousy because you're such a good writer. But those chapter summaries might be the things that people act on and take away regardless. So I say stick with it.
And that's all I want, man. I want people to just not make the same mistakes I made, because they're completely avoidable. You don't have to trudge around lost in your transition. And so, clearly you figured that out. And I'm going to be selfish for a minute. You've built and sold 4 companies. It's irrelevant to me what you built and sold. I really want to pick your brain on, I started this with the idea that the path back to purpose was through entrepreneurship. And then everything pivoted when I realized the biggest problem we face is in the transition. And one of those things is, I'm a poor kid from Indiana. That's where I grew up. That's why I joined the Army, was to get out of the farm town, working on the family farms that have been owned for generations, or the family construction companies. Like, there's just no way forward, at least in my opinion. And I'm sure the people I grew up with who find my content are going to disagree and blah, blah, blah. But they were also the people bullying me and treat me like shit growing up anyway. So I don't really care what they think. But for me, entrepreneurship being the path back to purpose. And the biggest thing, over the work that I've done, is I talk to veterans and they don't know entrepreneurship's an option. And then they find out it's an option, but then they find out, like, wow, this is going to be really hard and this is a big risk and I don't know how I'm going to survive. So can you speak to kind of the risk tolerance and, like, how did you overcome that? Because for me, it was a problem. I was in analysis paralysis and imposter syndrome for a long time, and thinking I had to figure everything out and have it all perfect before I'll start tomorrow. And what I found is, when I started, like, yeah, it's a risk, but I'm losing money doing what I do pretty consistently, but I'm happier than I've ever been in my entire life. And I genuinely mean that. I really am. it fills my cup up. There's not a day where I get out of bed and I'm not excited to come talk to another veteran or meet with somebody who's got an idea on how we can push, and refine transition, or, that veteran who's in my DMs this morning saying, I've lost my company. Nobody will take my calls. Nobody will take my emails. Hopefully our call tomorrow, you can give me some insights and help me out. And like, it's becoming my life's work, and it's so fulfilling and so meaningful that I don't even think about the risk. I don't even care about the money that I lose, or not lose, but I'm spending to do this. And really have just quit caring about money in general. Like, it's all made up anyway. I don't really care. And like, what's the worst that's going to happen? I'm going to go destroy my credit and be broke again. Well, I've had a bankruptcy in my life. That wasn't so bad, like how do you coach people or teach people to take this risk and bet on themselves? Because I genuinely in my soul believe trusting your intuition and your gut, it 99.999% of the time is going to make you live a life that you're proud and happy to be living. And the risk isn't as scary as you think it is.
Right. Right. Well, there's a couple of things I do, because I agree with you. There is, it's one of America's strengths, secret sauce, that we have an entrepreneurial culture. In fact, I'm giving a talk out in Ohio about, why American grand strategy is more successful than everybody else's. And I've got this chart in there that shows companies that have gone from zero to over $10 billion in market capitalization over the past 50 years in America versus all of Europe. So two areas relatively the same size. We're the same size economically up until 2014. The U.S. has almost lapped Europe since then. But the chart's incredible because it shows all these American companies and then there's this tiny little group of European companies. So like, what's going on here? Is it kind of people with the same DNA, same wealth demographics and everything? Why is one so profoundly more entrepreneurial successful than the others? Because it turned out it's the environment we put around it. We encourage it, we capitalize it, there's money available, and we don't guarantee success. Like Europe's got that, hey, we'll kind of guarantee you a living. It's kind of comfort democracies. And the US, you're like, hey, you may fall on your face or step on your what, and that's part of the journey, right? You don't hear that in Germany. They're like, oh, if you will catch you, it'll be soft and comfortable. And so that's good, but I think it's also overly seductive for everybody because everybody sees themselves in that position. So what I tell people is, how do you put these things together? It's not for everybody, and it's highly risky. But on the other hand, you're going to do it in the environment in all of human history most attuned to making entrepreneurs successful, and that's the U.S. today. And so a couple of things I give. One is, don't be afraid to start somewhere established, in other words, to get your feet under you. Okay? I tell this to my students. I'm like, go to a brand name place. It'll be boring. It'll be bureaucratic. It'll feel like the military sometimes.
You're going to learn.
Like everything. But you know why they're big and they have a brand name? Because they did a lot of things right over the past half century or century. And look around you and see what right looks like. Mm-hmm. From a process perspective, from a planning perspective, like that. Get those skills in the same way you did from Mother Army or Mother Navy or Mother Air Force or Mother Coast Guard, right? So that's one thing I say. And then when you do become an entrepreneur, know what game you're in. Okay. And what I mean by that is, when I took over the 4 different enterprises I did in 2 totally different industries, I knew the game I was in. The game I was in was to build the company on behalf of investors and ultimately sell it so they could make their money back. So when I'm thinking strategically, can I use a hockey analogy here? Are we up on
absolutely.
Hockey analogy?
Yeah,
do you remember the one Wayne Gretzky used to use where he said, I don't need to know I just need to know where the puck might be and I'll skate to that place. He had some analogy like that. So my equivalent of that when I'm running these companies is I don't need to necessarily think about where I want to go in and of itself. I need to see where all the potential buyers are going, what puck they're skating to, and I just need to be in their way. So they have to take me out along the way, right? So I would bend my strategy around to the strategic ambitions of a universe of potential buyers. So in other words, I knew what game I was in, right? I wasn't trying to, put Kmart out of business. I was trying to get Kmart to buy me, right? And so on. And when I really, and that's why I write about strategy and teach it. When I pull entrepreneurs aside and say, "What are you trying to get done here?" They'll give me the stuff that defines success for the week or the quarter or the year. But I'm like, no, 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 man, you're not hearing me. I'm like, don't tell me about task. Tell me about what is this? How does this movie end?
Yeah.
Right. And unbelievable, a lot of entrepreneurs never really thought through that. They figure if they do enough of the right things, it'll turn out okay in the end. And for me, that leaves a little too much to chance and fortune and the whimsies of both. So I think those two things, like don't be afraid to get a grounding in an established organization where there's less risk. You start building that network, you make those connections, you see things you like and don't like, and then once you do start, really spend some time, knowing what game you're in, as opposed to just trying to meet payroll, get to the next round of investment, figure out the next product or service, right?
I love
What are you
this.
actually trying to do here?
This advice is so good because I call it starting with the end in mind. What I defined what success looks like to me, and my definition is far different than a lot. I'm not trying to build $1 billion company. I'm not saying I'm not capable of that, but I don't want the lifestyle that comes with that and all of that, right? Like I have a target of 83,333 a month in MRR. That's $1 million a year, and I'm going to quit. That's it, right? Minimal time investment to maintain that, and I know it's extremely possible because I've been studying this and working at it for the last 18 months, and that's chump change. That's small numbers. Like people hear that number and they're like, "That's crazy money," and it's like, no, that's lowballing
Right.
it, right?
Yeah.
And so I really like what you're saying is like know the game you're playing. I very much know the game that I'm playing, and in an industry, and it's separate from anything that we're talking about on this podcast. And I don't talk about the other side of the things that I do very often, but I very much know that game. It's very new to the market. So it's kind of a blue ocean opportunity and one of those waves I get to kind of ride all the way through. So, studying the game that you're playing and the industry that you're playing it in is super imperative. And I think it makes that risk a lot more tolerable when you understand that.
Yeah. Blue ocean. Look at you throwing around the strategy lingo.
Brother, I come on, man. I love this shit, man. I mean it, man. Like my best friend, two very best friends in the whole world, and they're very opposite of one another. But he's the reason I'm doing all of this. He's the reason I started all of this. He challenged me on November 5th, 2023, when he moved into my house for 3 months straight out of Colombia because he's just a nomad, and that's great. But he said, start engaging with 5 people on LinkedIn whose content speaks to you and post every single day. Here we are, 15 months later, and I've got 10,000 followers. I've got a personal brand. Everything has kind of informed, the action that I took at the beginning informed the next action, and the next action, and the next action. I started to paint this bigger picture of where I was going with everything, and that's kind of it's exciting to me. It's enthralling because like every day I show up to do the same systems and processes that I've implemented in place, but I get to meet people like you who give me more ideas and inform the next steps for me. And through that, I've learned that like not every meeting you take is going to be a positive meeting, a high energy meeting, a great conversation like this one or whatever. But I've resigned myself to the fact that every single human being on this planet has something that I can learn from them. And whether I can use that now or I have to put it in my tool belt and pull it out 6, 8, 10 months later, you know, that's power. Like that's super powerful. And so part of your strategic thinking, I would probably imagine that you write about is like leveraging everything that's around you and opening, to that growth mindset, seeing the world from so many different perspectives really helps inform a lot of things, which makes that risk a whole lot more tolerable. Like I said, I've lost $15,000 over last year doing this podcast, investing in different tools, figuring it out as I go along, investing in people who didn't pan out. And that's like part of it. And I don't even care. I really just don't care because doing this every single day, controlling my time 100% with nobody to tell me you can't go to this doctor's appointment without taking PTO or you're using too many VA appointments, we're going to have to let you go. Like I don't ever want to be in that position again. I don't want people to have that power over me. And that's success to me, like controlling my time, hitting a target number. That's it. I don't need millions and billions of dollars. I have friends, I have family, I have, control of my time, and that makes the risk so much more stomachable, I think.
Yeah. Well, look, you didn't lose any money. You invested.
Yeah, exactly. I
Uh,
invested it to learn
yeah.
lessons that I could have only learned had I set out on this journey. And I say that all the time. Like, people, I think, oftentimes are afraid to fail. And I've kind of flipped that around and I just reframe that for myself. I welcome failure because that failure teaches me the lesson that I was only going to learn through that failure. I wouldn't have learned it any other way.
100%. Yeah. So all you have to do to think about, or anybody in a situation to think about the difference between losing and investing is change your formula for what was your return on invested capital. And you just got wisdom pretty cheap,
Yeah,
frankly,
I love that,
uh,
man.
all
Oh,
in
that's such a
all.
great reframe.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's
John,
a lot of life. I think you discovered, right? A lot of it's, it seems trite. You hear it from a great drill sergeant in your life. It's about attitude adjustment. Which usually happens at the pointy end of their boot, kind of
yeah,
thing, right? God, it's true. There's a
it
reason we
really
have
is.
these cliches. It's true enough.
Yeah,
And so reframing things. I talk in the book about strategists need to be realistically optimistic. And so what they do is they take a problem and they reframe it as a set of strategic options. I'm not going to think about it as a problem. I'm thinking about it as 4 or 5 different directions I might be able to go to advance the cause or the organization or the mission. And it's not a problem. It's just simply a set of strategic options and some choices I need to make. Now let's analyze them. Let's look at them. Let's see the pros and cons. Let's see the investment required to entertain. But all of a sudden, you're not thinking about a problem, right? You're thinking about a way, this luxury of having the choices of way forward.
yeah. Man, dude, so good. John, brother, we're at the end of our time here. I want people to be able to find you, buy your books, read your books. If you got coaching opportunities available, I want people to be able to reach out and just have the conversations that we're having, just like this, and inspire them to do something more than just get shoved into society's box, being told use your GI Bill benefits, get a 6-figure salary job, and congratulations, you're successful, you've transitioned. Well, that's just simply not true. And so, every person that comes on here is a prime example of what you can do through the transition. We've all had our struggles and we've all come out the other side, and maybe aren't what we would define as successful yet, or whatever, but we have a clear mission and are living a life that is in alignment with who we are as individuals. And so I want people to be able to reach out if this resonated with them and they want to talk to you.
Sure. So johnhillen.com is my website. You can just go there, and there's all kind of things on there, including stuff about the books and a bunch of other things I put on how to get in touch with me. Or hit me on LinkedIn, and do mention the podcast and everything when you hit me on LinkedIn. So I know you're not a soap salesman just trying to sell me more soap. I hate when
Not
people use LinkedIn for cold call selling.
Yeah, pitch slapping is what I
Yeah,
call it.
yeah,
Yeah, I hate
exactly.
it too. I don't
Yeah,
even. I just put them in the other inbox. I don't even read them.
yeah, yeah. So just let me know. It doesn't take that long to throw in a sentence about a bit of commonality that this community cares about each other on a LinkedIn invitation. So, yeah, all those things are a great way to get in touch. And as I mentioned, the books on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, however like you get your books. Every format. I think the Audible version comes out next month. If you're
Is
an
it
Audible
narrated
person.
by you?
It is not, because I wanted to get, because it's a series of dialogues, right? This is the way people learn. And so what I've done is I've recast all the great strategic problems, like the 10 strategic problems people commonly have. Blue Ocean's in chapter 5, by the way. And I recast them as a series of people sitting around talking about them, and somebody smart writing up on the whiteboard what's going on. So there's
Well,
whiteboard moments throughout it. So that's why it's called the strategy dialogues. I mean, kind of Plato invented this, with Socrates sitting around with his students trying to work out, how do we answer these big questions? But it's been around for humanity. The Bible does this, the Bhagavad Gita, you name it.
we're
We
doing
learn by
this on a
talking to each
podcast.
other.
We're doing this on a
Yeah,
podcast, man.
exactly. We're having a dialogue. And by this conversation, we and your listeners may ascend to a higher level of understanding or have a different train of thought. So that's the idea behind the book. So I needed an actor who could do a good dialogue between 4 or 5 people without being too dramatic and cheesy. And so I found an amazing one, and so that'll be out next month. The Audible.
Awesome. John, brother, I really appreciate your time today. I know you're a busy man. I really appreciate you sharing your insights and your advice and all of that. Ladies and gentlemen, please like, rate, review, subscribe. Help me just get this in front of all of our brothers and sisters, because I really do believe through these conversations is how we heal as a community and stop taking our own lives. The transition doesn't have to be as painful as it actually is. Don't forget, I do have a free community, the antithesis of bully, toxic Facebook groups, where you can come share the challenge that you're going through and have people who've actually walked a mile in your shoes, or who are actually trying to get through it and live better lives, give you actionable advice from their perspective, what they went through when they were going through it. There's also several entrepreneurs in there, from laser engravers to real estate moguls to franchise opportunities. I really want this to be the premier veteran community where you can get kind of resources you're not going to find anywhere else, as I continue to curate them and meet other people. So please take advantage of that community. It only works if you guys join and come be vulnerable and talk about what you're going through. And until next week, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you with another one. That's our show, and I'm truly thankful you've joined us at The Strategic Veteran. If our conversation today sparked curiosity, or if you're ready to elevate your game, I'm here to help. Visit thestrategicveteran.com for exclusive show notes and resources, or to book a coaching session directly with me. Take a moment to subscribe to our podcast and share your review. Your support makes all the difference. For more insights and daily strategies, let's connect on LinkedIn and keep the conversation going. Remember, this isn't just a podcast, it's your strategic advantage in action. Until our next rendezvous, stay bold and continue the mission.